You're listening to Parasearch UK Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch UK Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the KTPF Reload Show. In case you're wondering what the Reload Show is about, if you haven't heard previous shows, these are the interviews that were conducted by good friends of mine, Steve and Sue Taggart, in the days of the KTPF radio show. Their own radio show ran for just over 4 years, broadcasting every week for over 3 hours. I joined them in the last 18 months of the show's run, but eventually the guys felt they'd just about had enough. It was a monumental effort to keep broadcasting every week for 3 hours. It was a wonderful show. But unfortunately they're no longer involved, and the shows have just sort of sat in the archives, so I thought it would be nice to bring them back to life and bring you the interviews that the guys conducted over those 4 years. They include some of the most interesting people within the world of the paranormal and some not so well known but still, nevertheless still very interesting. We even have one or two rather unusual shows, including a live seance and other things along those lines. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed tonight's show, and this is the KTPF Reload Show. Enjoy.
This program deals with themes of an adult nature and is intended for a mature audience. They've landed.
You're in the right place. Online, on the web, and on air. All over the world.
Talk radio.
You hear us, we hear you.
Yeah, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of the KTPF Community Talk Show. My name is Suzanne.
And I'm Steve.
And over in Essex, we have our regular co-host, parapsychologist and historian, Mr. Andy Mercer. Good evening, Andy.
Hello, guys. How's it going there?
Not too bad.
Good stuff.
Okay. So what have we got on this evening for you? Tonight we have Nick Redfern, and he talks about Chupacabras, a legendary cryptid rumoured to inhabit parts of the Americas, with the first sighting reported in Puerto Rico. The name comes from the Americans' reported habit, the animals' reported habit of attacking and drinking blood of livestock, especially goats. I assure you, no Americans were doing that. Author of Chupacabra Road Trip in Search of the Elusive Beast, released last year in October, Nick discusses his personal investigations into the continuing legacy of the fearsome beast. So what do you think to that then, guys?
It's one of those ones that sounds intriguing. I've seen quite a few programmes talking about this creature, but there doesn't seem to be anything particularly definitive. A few sort of videos and images that have turned up they've found alternate explanations of what these creatures might be. So I'm intrigued to see what Nick makes of it. He seems to be he is obviously a very good, well-dedicated researcher into various topics. So it'll be interesting to see what his take on these things are.
Hello, Nick.
Hey.
Hi, you're live on the air.
Okay, cool, thanks for them.
Just out of curiosity, am I ringing a landline or a mobile?
This is a landline.
Oh, right, okay. It's just that it's come up mobile on there for some reason. First of all, Nick, can you tell us a bit about yourself? Just because since we last spoke to you, we've got some new listeners. Oh
yeah, sure.
You know, in America and stuff. So if you can just recap a bit about yourself for them.
Yeah, sure. Well, I grew up just about 5 miles outside of the city of Lichfield in Staffordshire. And my interest in sort of paranormal stuff and, across the board really kind of stems from when my mum and dad took me on a week's holiday to Scotland and we went to Loch Ness. and spent a day at Loch Ness, and my dad told me the story of the Loch Ness Monster, and I still got a few fragments and memories of that trip, that first time I went to Loch Ness, and when you're sort of 5 or 6, it's sort of like an exciting story, like monsters in the wardrobe or under the bed or whatever. And but when I got to sort of about 9 or 10, something like that, I started reading like John Keel's books, where I sort of jumped from the famous 5 to John Keel. And so that's when I started reading books on the subject. So that's what got me interested and involved. But as far as sort of writing books and magazine articles, that kind of thing's concerned, I wasn't sort of the best student at school, to put it mildly. I didn't get any O-levels or nothing like that. I didn't go no college, no university, no A-levels. I think I left school with like 4, for people who remember them, the old CSEs. I think I got like 4 CSEs, and all 4 were like grade 4. I was useless at school, but I enjoyed writing. When I was a little kid, I used to write stories, but I enjoyed writing, I enjoyed reading. When I left school, I spent about 4 years for a painting and decorating company as a van driver, and 4 years as a forklift driver. But all in this time, I was still doing like little bits of writing for like Graham Birdsall's old, before UFO magazine. We had a newsletter that Graham, I think, used to put together from his front room, just staple it together and photocopy. It's called Quest. Yeah. So I was writing for that back in the late 80s, but it was just like a little hobby back then. And but then when I was about 27, 28, I thought, well, the articles have been received okay, so why don't I ever go out writing a book? And so I decided to do that. And I thought, well, if it takes off, that's great. If it doesn't, I've still got the forklift license, which I still do. I've still got that to this day. It did take off, and that was like 20 years ago, or 19 years ago, when my first book was published. And I've just sort of done it since. I sort of write primarily on 2 issues, one being UFOs and the other one cryptozoology, which is the study of unknown animals.
Okay. So how did you manage to get to living in America?
Well, I actually got a job offer about 16 years ago. And as well as writing my own books, I also do a lot of editing and proofreading and that kind of thing for other authors, ghostwriting, that kind of stuff. Yeah. And I got an offer. It was like a 2-year job, doing sort of exactly those different tasks for a company. And so I thought, well, it's interesting. I didn't have any ties, where I was tied to the UK and, couldn't do it. And so I thought, yeah, it'd be sort of cool to see a bit more of the world, because when I was a kid, when I was about 14, I sort of got the travel bug. But my mum and dad said, I had a pen friend in France, and they said, do you want to go over for 2 weeks? So they paid for me just to go over there, and I was like 13. I spent 2 weeks with this other family, and then so I kind of got the travel bug at an early age, and I've sort of spent a lot of my life on the road actually. But then I got this job offer, and enjoyed the work, and it was all based out of Dallas, which is where I still live. And I like the Dallas area. There's plenty to do, and it's just like any sort of regular modern city. And so I liked it, and then applied for American residency. Where you sort of officially immigrate to another country, and did all the paperwork for that, and which actually takes a couple of years, for the whole process to be complete. And I said that was like 2001, so sort of 15 years ago now, 16, coming up to 16. So.
God. So you're like in Paranormal Central, really, aren't you? Because it all happens in America.
Well, I guess it depends what you're sort of looking for. There's certainly a lot of UFO activity in the US and, things like that. But I think the big difference, I guess, between the UK and the US is that in the UK, you have a lot more sort of ancient mysteries, you know, going back to the 14 and 1500s, and because, you know, America's a relatively new country, a lot of the mysteries tend to be from the last couple of centuries. You know, I mean, a lot of people over here still find it amazing when I tell them that the little village I grew up in 1994, it celebrated its 1000th anniversary. It was actually, the origins go back to 994. And so that's the big difference. But I mean, I think in many respects there's a lot of similarities. You know, you get kind of similar things like UFO sightings, but you also get sort of lake monsters, you know, like American equivalents of the Loch Ness Monster, haunted houses, you know, you name it. So, you know, there isn't that much that's overly different. I think most of the differences are probably more sort of cultural rather than having a direct sort of impact on, you know, the phenomenon themselves.
Well, we've got a couple of questions later about your UFO side. I know there's one guest, particularly in the chat room, who's interested in your UFO coverage. But before we go into that, just out of curiosity, you say you've been doing this for a few decades, and you work both in UFO and cryptozoology. Is there one specific phenomena that has disturbed you during your research?
I wouldn't necessarily say disturbed. I'm not sort of the kind of person who sort of gets frightened or disturbed. It's more like an adrenaline rush for me, you know, when I'm investigating things. When I like to sort of go out, you know, on an expedition into the woods looking for Bigfoot, or, you know, going to investigating a lake monster story. You know, we perhaps camp out on the shores for 2 nights with night vision equipment and sort of take a little dinghy or a boat out onto the lake. You know, I mean, to me, that doesn't sort of get me worried or nothing. It just gets me, you know, fired up. So that's sort of the approach I take. You know. Right.
Okay. Now, onto the elusive Chupacabra, and as far as I know, it is elusive. And your book that is entitled just that, The Chupacabra Road Trip in Search of the Elusive Beast. Can you tell us about this creature and how it became such an enigma?
Well, yeah, I've been on a lot of expeditions looking for the Chupacabra. The sightings actually began in 1995 in Puerto Rico. That's where the phenomenon originally kind of kicked off, or probably more correct to say it's kind of exploded. You know, it was everywhere immediately. And farmers were reporting farm animals allegedly drained of blood and with these 2 like puncture wounds on the neck, kind of like a classic vampire type bite. And, you know, when you sort of combine that with the allegations that blood was drained from the animals, it very, very quickly developed into sort of a story of a creature that was sort of part flesh and blood, but part sort of supernatural. And in no time at all, you know, Puerto Rico was in a state of sort of hysteria and fear. And you had like the local civil defence people, the police, veterinarians, all sorts of people looking into this mystery to try and figure out what was going on. And it was described as like, imagine something about the size of a chimpanzee and the build of a chimpanzee, but hairless, but having these very sharp claws, and almost like a punk rock mohawk kind of row of spikes going down its head and neck. That's how it was described. And some of the witnesses described it as having like backlight wings, you know, sort of like membrane-type wings.
Yeah.
So in that sense, you know, it's sort of a really weird-looking animal. And the sightings have gone on ever since, but it doesn't get the coverage that it does today. But in 2004 was the first time I went to Puerto Rico with, I don't know if you know John Downs in England. John runs the Centre for Fortean Zoology.
Yeah, we know John.
Oh, okay. Well, me and John went out to Puerto Rico with the Sci-Fi Channel in 2004. I think it was about 10, 12 days, something like that. And they basically sort of followed us on like a road trip type investigation, just travelling around Puerto Rico, speaking to farmers whose animals have been attacked, speaking to people in the medical community, scientific communities, police officers. And it sort of, I guess for me and John, it sort of opened our eyes to the fact that, you know, this is a real phenomenon and the people on the island are taking it very seriously. So that was sort of an important thing. You know, I think you can learn a lot from the internet, but you don't really pick up that real sense of it until you actually find yourself in the heart of it, in the woods, you know, or on somebody's farm, and they tell you about what they saw and what happened. And then I was back in the following year with a Canadian company called Red Star Films to make another documentary about it. And again, we had a lot of people to speak to. One of them actually was somebody who used to work in the Civil Defence Unit, and when he left, excuse me, just to backtrack, when he was working for them, I should say, he actually investigated officially a number of Chupacabra attacks, a large number, for Puerto Rican authorities. And when he retired, they actually let him take with him this huge dossier of material, which is about 2 inches thick, 3 inches thick maybe. Hundreds and hundreds of pages of autopsy reports, photographs, drawings by the witnesses of the Chupacabra, all this kind of stuff. And I guess the only way I can really describe it is like as a real-life X-file, which it really was. He was working on behalf of Puerto Rican authorities as a member of the Civil Defence Unit to investigate these cases. And he pulled out this huge file of material and, allowed it to be filmed and photographed and read from. And, that was the kind of thing, you would never sort of find on the internet, because you've really got to sort of seek these people out and then get their attention and also gain their confidence and trust, in you, and show the witnesses respect, and then they understand that you're going to treat this seriously. So that's, those are all important issues, but it really sort of did open me up to, wow, this isn't a myth, it isn't a legend. Here's the photographs of the animals attacked, here's the prints on the ground where it was walking when it was muddy. So, I came back. And now I've been on there many occasions to Puerto Rico, the most recent time just a couple of years ago, and again got, a batch of whole new reports showing that it's still going on.
Right. Have you got questions, Steve?
Yeah, I got a question. You mentioned about the Chupacabra being like fang marks on like a vampire bat, so to speak. But could it actually be like the vampire bat, where it doesn't actually suck the blood out, but it just makes an incision and then drinks the blood that way?
Well, that's actually a good question, because one of the theories for the Chupacabra is that it is some sort of bat, but obviously not a regular-sized bat. Most bats are quite small. Now, you do get some, which have a significant wingspan, but most of the witnesses who've seen this creature, they have described it as like a bat-like face, like a monkey-like face. If you look at a bat's face, it does kind of look monkey-like. Now, the wingspan that some of the people have spoken about is sort of like 12 to 14 feet. So if it is a bat, then it's a completely unknown type of bat, which, science and zoology would tell us doesn't exist, but scientists and zoologists are sometimes wrong, So, but I've heard that theory many times on Puerto Rico, and, the term, you're right, the term vampire bat is actually quite incorrect, because people think of vampires, they think of creatures sucking blood out of other animals or out of people. But in reality, when a bat drinks the blood, if you like, it actually doesn't suck it at all. What it does, it has these two sharp teeth which make a cut in the animal, and the saliva of a bat contains what's called a anticoagulant, so the blood doesn't clot. It's like you cut your finger, after a while it stops bleeding, dries up because the blood clots. But the saliva of the bat prevents it from clotting, so they can keep, what they actually do, they lap the blood, they don't suck it. That's sort of a myth. But, there's no doubt that there are parallels between the appearance of a bat and the Chupacabra. And what's interesting is that Puerto Rico has a huge cave system and caverns and tunnels, many of which are very much underexplored, and some of them are actually closed by Puerto Rican authorities. They won't allow people in, which is interesting. But most of those caves are sort of filled to the brim with bats. Give you one example. When I went there with John in 2004, we went in this huge cave, and if you looked up, it looked like the ceiling of the cave was black, but it was all moving. What it actually was, it was just packed with thousands of bats on the ceiling. And one of the guides told us, not to look up too much, because, if you get bat saliva on you, a lot of the bats have got rabies. And we were wandering around, and a bat actually peed on my shoulder, and the bandana hat that I'd got on, and people were saying, oh, you've got to get a rabies jab, and I'm not getting a rabies jab. I'll sort of see how I am in 2 days' time. If I start acting like a crazy zombie, then I'll get the shot.
So when you hear about the vampiric and the drain of blood and everything, are these just elaborate reports of the stories then? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that there's a real animal. I'm absolutely 100% sure of that, and I'm sure it's an animal or a creature unknown to science. But in saying that, now, we do have examples of, where the animals are being killed by these puncture wounds. And what's interesting is that in most cases, the animals, didn't make much noise. For example, you think of a farm in America or in the in the UK, you think of a very large body of land. Unfortunately, a lot of people in Puerto Rico are quite poor, so their farm might actually be like their back garden, where they've got cages and, for animals and whatever. But they didn't wake up in the middle of the night hearing their animals screaming. It was like something killed them, but was able to prevent them from making any noise. Chickens and goats and things like that would be making all sorts of noises, if they've been attacked. But, yeah, the stories about the blood draining are they're sort of mixed and controversial, because some researchers and ranchers I've spoken to said that the bodies of the animals found on their property were autopsied and were found to be missing significant amounts of blood. However, when I tried to chase these stories down, I could never get beyond the claim. I never found although I got official documents showing that animals have been autopsied and studied, I never got one that talked actually about the blood being drained or significant amounts of blood gone. But there was no doubt that something strange was killing these farm animals. And so in case people don't know, although Puerto Rico, it's a fairly large island, and it has this huge rainforest, the El Yunque rainforest, which looks like, if you parachuted in blindfolded, you might think you're in the middle of South America or, the African jungle. That's how it looks. But on Puerto Rico, there aren't any local indigenous large wild animals. There's nothing like lions, tigers, big cats, nothing. Wolves. All you've got, the only large animals are the imported ones that are used for food, like pigs, goats, cows, that kind of thing. So, in other words, whatever is killing these animals, has to be an animal that isn't recognised as living on Puerto Rico.
Right, okay. So, there's been reports in Texas as well. Now, it has been said that 2 of the most recent sightings have occurred in Texas, with both creatures being caught on camera. Has one ever been captured or even killed, as the pictures in the news suggest?
Yeah, as far as the Texas ones are concerned, this is where it gets controversial, because I own the skull of one, and a friend of mine, Ken Gerhard, who lives in San Antonio, Ken actually had the frozen corpse of one in his freezer
Really?
for about 2 years. But where it gets confusing is because the original Puerto Rican Chupacabra is very different to what's become known as the Texas Chupacabra. What I've found has happened, going to all these different places, is that where there have been animal attacks and people have seen a weird creature, and they've heard these original stories of the Chupacabra, people have said, oh, well, this must be the Chupacabra because it's just like those attacks on Puerto Rico. So in no time at all, and I understand how this kind of thing develops, in no time at all you had people saying, oh, well, that the Chupacabra's come to Texas. But the Texas Chupacabra, there's one big difference between that and the Puerto Rican one. We have probably, somewhere in the region now, about 15 corpses and numerous footage and photographs. And an autopsy of the bodies has shown that these animals have coyote blood in them, coyote DNA. There's no doubt about that. But what's interesting is that they're not regular coyotes. And I'll explain what I mean by that. The animals are always hairless, completely hairless. Now, the skeptics have said, well, they're just hairless coyotes because they've got a bad case of mange. Mange being a condition caused by a mite, which causes hair loss. It also causes the animal to scratch and itch to the point where, they cut themselves and infection sets in and they often die. However, with the Texas Chupacabra, they're like 100% hairless. If you look at pictures of animals with mange, they've got like tufts of hair here, then tufts there, with a bald patch in between. But these animals are totally different. On top of that, their front limbs are sort of developing at a different length to the back limbs, so they have this weird kangaroo-like hopping movements, and they have these strange pouches on their hind legs, which no one can figure out what these large pouches are. They're about the size of like a peach, something like that. They're pretty big, and their top jaw overhangs their bottom jaw, rather than being sort of uniformly level together. And they also psychologically are different. Most coyotes hunt at night. The reason why so many of these have been shot and killed or hit by cars or photographed is because they do a lot of their hunting in the day. And they're not frightened of people. There are some cases where they've been very aggressive around people. And there's one very weird story where 3 of these animals actually tried to, triangulate and surround a farmer. And, he felt he was going to be attacked. That's sort of unheard of in regular coyotes. And Ken Gerhard, who I mentioned earlier, Ken thinks that what's going on is that they may have been affected by what are called mutagens, certain things which can actually, generally connected to pollution, which can affect an animal at like a DNA level and cause bizarre mutations. And Ken thinks that that's what's going on. So we're not dealing with the same thing that's been seen on Puerto Rico, but in many respects we're dealing with something almost even more intriguing, the idea that our pollutants with these mutagens, we're actually altering a known species into something else.
So we're saying that it's not down to deformity or riddled with mange, but it could be down to mutations. So are we talking things like pesticides or something that's been laying around?
Well, one of the things that Ken did, he looked at the sort of geographical locations where most of the Texas Chupacabra sightings have occurred, and a lot of them are around the heavily forested areas of San Antonio and Austin. A lot of people think Texas is desert, but that's actually like Arizona. Most of Texas, certainly all of East Texas, and bordering on Dallas where I am, is heavily forested. For hundreds and hundreds of square miles, and that's the same down by Ken. It has a lot of forested land around by Austin and San Antonio. And Ken did a study of where the attacks were occurring, and he found that in the area where a lot of the sightings were made, you had a lot of coal-related industries going on, and these coal-burning plants. And one of the side effects of the burning that goes on at these plants is the release of what's called sulfur dioxide. And sulfur dioxide is a mutagen. And you can find numerous examples of what happens when animals are exposed to mutagens. There was a famous case from Minnesota a few years ago where an entire colony, if you like, of frogs in one particular pool in Minnesota had been affected by mutagens, and they were developing extra eyes and extra limbs. But the weird thing was that they weren't sort of useless limbs or useless eyes. They actually worked, so it was as if the animals again were being changed at a DNA level. And the fact that these mutagens, and particularly sulfur dioxide, are present in excessive amounts in the areas where the Texas Chupacabra has been seen, I think, Ken's made a good, solid argument that might be the reason why we're seeing those animals in those areas.
Okay. Does it have any intelligence, or is it just acting like a wild animal?
Well, certainly the one in Texas, they kind of behave like regular coyotes, aside from the fact that they're not frightened by people, and they're quite aggressive around people as well. That's not typical. Now, as far as Puerto Rico is concerned, it's a very different thing. That one seems to be kind of highly intelligent and For example, the first time I went there with John Downs, one of the people we interviewed was a rancher, and he got sort of about 20 to 30 cages in his backyard, if you like, his little farm area, and each chicken was in a separate cage. And he woke up the next morning, they were all dead. And where the cages were to his bedroom, where him and his wife slept, was like 25 feet at the most. A very small area. And yet not a single one of these chickens made any noise during the night. And a number of witnesses have said that the Chupacabra seems to have the ability to prevent animals from making noises. Kind of like if you see like a rabbit caught in the stare of a snake, the animal freezes and it doesn't even try and run. It's basically paralyzed with fear. But it's as if the snake actually, controls it. And that's one of the theories that's been put forward, that the Puerto Rican Chupacabra can actually sort of almost hypnotize the animals it wants to kill to make sure they stay silent. But what's even more interesting is that these cages in which the animals were kept, it wasn't just like they were sitting in a cage. The cages all had like a door lock on them, kind of where, you pick it up, push it to one side, then pick it up again, and it opens the door. It's like a three-way kind of lock. And the cages hadn't been torn apart violently or anything like that. Whatever had got into the cages had actually opened them. So that suggests a strong, degree of intelligence. But it was clearly not the work of people, because you had these sort of fang marks on the neck. And in a lot of them, there was also like a one single wound in the stomach area. Not on every occasion, but I've found that on many occasions where there's this, just one hole on the stomach. So, you have things like that suggest that it's not just some sort of wild, savage animal that attacks at random, that it actually carefully chooses the sites, and it's very careful not to get caught, and even has stealthy ways of killing the animals and getting into the cages as well.
Okay. Now, I read somewhere that these attacks could go further back than the 90s, maybe as early as the 70s. I recall reading 2 reports, both in Texas, where there were mutilated cattle, no blood around, no tracks. Do you know anything about this?
Well, yeah, what I can tell you for sure with Puerto Rico is that back in the 1970s, specifically 1975, there were reports of what became known as the Mocha vampire. Mocha, which is M-O-C-A. Mocha's a place on Puerto Rico, and in the mid-70s, people were reporting farm animals being attacked by this creature that became known as the Mocha vampire. And as its name suggests, people were saying it was killing animals and draining them of blood. Now, this was exactly 20 years before the Chupacabra sightings, and even the Chupacabra name was created. But if you look back at it with hindsight, it sounds just like that the Mocha vampire was the Chupacabra. Yeah. I think the big difference is that pretty much back in 1975, a lot of the stories just didn't make it off the island of Puerto Rico. There weren't sort of any paranormal magazines back then, although the internet was certainly sort of kicking off in the mid-90s, and that sort of helped get the stories out elsewhere. In the 70s, it just pretty much what happens in Puerto Rico stays in Puerto Rico, that kind of thing. Yeah. And so every time I've been to Puerto Rico, I've got earlier stories, some from the 80s when people called them devil birds, and I actually got other reports that me and John investigated from the 70s as well. So, and I've also got a report from the 1960s near the Arecibo telescope, which interestingly enough is used in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. There was actually a cow was found dead, and actually that was one case where it was confirmed that a significant amount of blood had been removed from the animal, from the body of the animal, and in that case the cow was found literally on the sort of the fringes of the telescope facility itself, and it was seen by or found by a security guard. But a couple of days earlier, another security guard had seen what he described as like a dark or dressed man, cloaked, wandering around that exact same area. Now, I told this story to a number of people, and they wondered if it could not have actually been, a dark cloaked man, but perhaps it could have been like a giant bat, something along those lines that he'd actually seen at a distance and assumed it was a man with a cloak. And it would be kind of strange to see somebody dressed in a black cloak in the middle of the day in Puerto Rico, where it's very hot. So that was the 60s, and so it wouldn't surprise me if one day we didn't get even earlier reports. So I don't think it is actually a new phenomenon. I think it's sort of a relatively newly appreciated phenomenon.
Right, okay. Andy's got a question for you, haven't you, Andy?
Well, no, not really, Nat. He's kind of answered it, really.
Oh, has he answered it for you?
Well, yeah, just the idea of if they've only been around since the 1980s, then why they only started then? But from what you're saying is they were around earlier and they just weren't really talked about. It wasn't what they did. So it kind of answered my question before I even asked it. So
okay, well, yeah, Brendan's got a question for you. He's a bit late. So he said, you may have already asked this, but it coincides with my next question. He's asking whether you think it's ET related of origin, or maybe a mutant animal that may have escaped from a test centre, etc. My next question for you was, I find a lot of coincidences. For instance, if you see a Bigfoot or a ghost, there are also UFO activities. Can the same be said about Chupacabras? Can you answer both questions at the same time?
Yeah, I actually can. I mean, every time I've been to Puerto Rico, I've heard several theories from the people on the island as to what they think is going on. One is the one we've already discussed, the giant bat theory.
Yeah.
Another one is the idea of something escaped from a lab, sort of doing bizarre genetic experiments. And then you've got the UFO angle. We mentioned the bat one, as I said, but as far as the idea of like secret experiments, one of the reasons why I think this story or this theory, I should say, has surfaced is because there's a little island just off the main Puerto Rican island where for years a place existed called the Caribbean Primate Research Centre, and they do a lot of research involving like rhesus monkeys and smaller monkeys, and a lot of this is done to understand and cure what's called SIV, which is the monkey equivalent of HIV in people, which causes AIDS. So a lot of the research is actually like done to try and figure out better ways to cure AIDS and HIV in people. But although that's just like a regular primate lab that does research, there've been a lot of stories of far more secret labs on the island where allegedly, and I need to stress that, allegedly that bizarre experimentation has been undertaken on monkeys and chimpanzees to create like a killing machine that could be used on the battlefield. And some of the stories, if you've ever seen the movie 28 Days Later, the zombie type movie, it came out in the early 2000s, well, that begins with like a secret lab in the UK where they're doing research with what's called the rage virus. You get the rage virus in your bloodstream, it turns you like into a homicidal killer. And that's kind of like the stories coming out of Puerto Rico. They believe that these animals have been physically mutated, but also psychologically mutated, and that the theory being if we could sort of have an entire army of them just unleashed on the battlefield, they would tear the enemy apart. Now, I'm not sure to what extent our technology today is actually at that level. You can never sort of say for sure what's going on behind closed doors and in secret, and how far advanced it might really be.
Yeah.
But, that's sort of far beyond what at least is known publicly. But a lot of people do support that theory. Now, as far as the alien theory is concerned, there's no doubt that in the same time frame that the Puerto Rican Chupacabra issue was sort of really, breaking out in Puerto Rico in the mid-90s, there actually was, a huge wave of UFO activity as well, and very often in the same areas. So that's sort of given rise to an understandable connection between the two. To give you an example, or one example of many, a lot of reports which reach me of sort of black triangular-shaped UFOs, which have become sort of a central part of ufology in the last 20 years or so, and become known as flying triangles. I've got a lot of reports from the second time I went there of people who saw late at night these black triangles coming out of the waters off the coastal waters off Puerto Rico, which is obviously an island, so, you know, all around the island people were talking about these large black triangles coming out of the water. And it gave rise to the theory of sort of like an underwater or an undersea base, that kind of thing, an extraterrestrial base. I've got reports where people had seen UFOs over certain farms, and then the next night, you know, the animals were mutilated by what appeared to be the Chupacabra. So, you know, you can make a case for the extraterrestrial angle. And the one other theory that is actually probably the most prevalent one that I've come across, at least, you know, there's a great deal of sort of superstition on Puerto Rico. A lot of people sort of take the view that it's sort of a paranormal creature that's been, I guess, conjured up, you know, using rites and rituals, that kind of thing. And there are a number of religions and groups on Puerto Rico that do engage in sort of sacrificial rites, you know, to paranormal entities and things like that. So that's another theory that's kind of surfaced. But as far as, you know, to get to the next part of the question, which you brought up, Suzanne, about the issue of UFOs and Bigfoot and things like that being seen in the same area. I mean, that happens a lot. I mean, you have people like John Keel, who decades ago was talking about this. Like a lot of researchers, you know, Keel started off as someone who thought Bigfoot was just a giant ape and UFOs were nuts and bolts spacecraft, but then he kind of found a lot of places around the US which were sort of hotspots for numerous different types of phenomena, and that's sort of what I found over the years, and it sort of fairly significantly changed a lot of my views to where I think a lot of these phenomena are interconnected. And I sometimes, you know, not sometimes, I mean, you know, I'm sort of pretty much of the idea that a great deal of these phenomena are sort of more interdimensional, if you like, than extraterrestrial. And I think the fact that Bigfoot is so elusive, and we do get a lot of weird reports of Bigfoot vanishing in a flash of light or just fading away. You know, to me, it's clearly more or less than a regular animal. Just, you know, it's just too elusive. Yeah. That's one of the problems. And I mean, to give you a good example, another good example is the fact that where I live here in Texas, just outside Houston, there's a huge area of forest called the Big Thicket. Well, the Big Thicket for decades has been the home of reports of Bigfoot-type creatures. You could actually find old 19th century newspapers from the area where they talked about seeing hairy wild men in the Big Thicket. Well, it happens that there's a large road, well, not a large road, but it runs all the way through the Big Thicket, called Bragg Road. But locally, it's known by the people of the area as Ghost Light Road, because people see these weird balls of light flitting through the trees. They're about the size of a basketball, something like that, or a football. And they seem to either be under intelligent control or they are some sort of bizarre intelligent energy which reacts to the presence of people. But they've been seen in exactly the same locations where the Bigfoot creatures have been seen. Kind of on that same pattern, there have been numerous really good UFO sightings over Loch Ness. There have been a number of Men in Black encounters at Loch Ness. So I kind of sort of take the same approach today that Keel did, the idea that we're dealing with something that in some respects that we still don't obviously understand. Many of these phenomena seem to have a single point of origin, even though they seem quite different.
Yeah. Now, has there been any scat evidence found?
There has. Ken Gerhardt's done a lot of research in that area. Thankfully, I haven't. But, yeah, I mean, not in terms of Puerto Rico, but, you know, we have in Texas, and again, it just bolsters the view that these are coyotes, but it doesn't explain, obviously, you know, the physical mutations and the psychological changes in the, you know, the way in which, as I said, the animals aren't frightened of people. So, but, you know, you get reports of Chupacabra-type creatures everywhere. I mean, there was a spate, of all places, Russia, in 2014, they were actually described very much like the American one, the Texas one, but much bigger. And interestingly enough, a number of the witnesses in Russia said that when they saw these animals, they had the ability to rise up onto their hind legs, and they felt it was like an intimidation kind of thing. Kind of like a bear. You know, you see a bear wandering through the woods on its hind legs, and it will raise itself up onto its back legs. Well, there are a few people who claim to have seen the Texas Chupacabra who've also said that it raised itself up onto its hind legs and kind of ran with a weird hopping movement, which regular coyotes cannot do that. There's actually just, as far as I know, one picture relative to this. It's one case I personally investigated just over the border from Texas into Oklahoma. It was a case in 2010, and it came from a guy named Ryan Craighead, Carighead. If you Google Ryan Craighead plus Chupacabra, you'll see Ryan's photograph of this, what looks just like a Texas Chupacabra. It's got the extremely, ridiculously short front legs, and he's captured it as it's sort of bouncing along almost on its hind legs. And I don't know if you're in front of a laptop or anything right now, but if you Google, as I said, Ryan Craighead plus Chupacabra, you'll see Ryan's picture. And that's one classic example of people seeing these animals running and bouncing in ways that they should not do. So that sort of is very similar to the Russian ones. There have been reports from South America, particularly Chile and Brazil, where farm animals have been attacked, etc., and people have seen these winged type of Chupacabra as well. John, in 1998, John Downs extensively investigated a number of reports from Mexico when he went out there for a couple of weeks. So, you get these reports more and more. The big question is, which category of Chupacabra are they? I think what's happened is that the term Chupacabra has become so kind of iconic that any kind of weird-looking animal, people say, oh, it's a Chupacabra. Yeah. There have been a few reports over here. People have seen, like, for example, skunks and possums, which legitimately did have mange. And people said, I've caught a Chupacabra. And when I went to look at it, I said, no, you really do have a mangy possum, And they're like, no, it's a Chupacabra. I said, no, it's a mangy possum. But everybody knows the term Chupacabra. But, so it doesn't take away the fact that there is a weird, significant element to all this. But what's happened is it becomes such a part of popular culture that, you have to be very careful how we sort of deal with it all.
Yeah. So what do you think it might be, and where do you think it's come from? What's your opinion?
Well, I mean, we're pretty much sure what the Texas one is. We're not 100% sure as to why it has these weird mutations. Now, as far as the Puerto Rican one's concerned, I would be pretty willing to suggest, even though it's controversial, extremely controversial, I'd be willing to accept the idea of something like a giant bat. I mean, that the fossil record shows that, way back when, millions of years ago, animals that exist today still existed back then, but, they're much bigger. A lot of people don't realise crocodiles were around at the time of the dinosaurs, but they survived, the extinction of the dinosaurs. But the crocodiles back then were like, there was one particular crocodile that was like 50 feet long. There'd been equivalents, fossilized remains, for example, of the equivalents of today's dragonflies and things like that, with 2-foot wingspans. So it wouldn't, I don't think, doubt the question that we could be dealing with something like a monstrous-sized bat. The only problem, really, with that theory is why there should be specifically UFO sightings in the same vicinity as the Puerto Rican Chupacabra. If this is just an unknown animal living deep in the caves of Puerto Rico, there shouldn't be a UFO connection, but there clearly is, whether people like it or not. I think the one that I find least likely is the genetic experiment angle, because, I'm just not sure that today our technology has the ability to turn a chimpanzee into like some sort of killing machine which has got wings grafted on it. It's, to me, that's like sci-fi. Well, maybe somebody might prove me wrong one day, but, we are doing weird stuff today with gene splicing and, the whole idea of splicing even different animals together. That's been the subject of a great deal of controversy. So, I kind of veer between the idea of a known animal that's massively mutated like a giant bat, but I can't get away from the UFO angle. So I think, I think it's one or the. It can't be both, I don't think. Because I think it has to be one or the other, but it could still go either way for me.
Okay. Now, is there anything happening now in Puerto Rico or anywhere? Has the attacks increased or is it quietened down?
Well, I mean, that's a good question because people assume the attacks aren't going on as much because we just don't hear much about the new cases. And again, it's kind of like, if you look at the internet, as amazing as a resource as it is, and how much it's changed our lives for the better in the last few years, people, I mean, I've spoken to people and I've said, well, I got these cases from last year, and they're like, well, there's nothing on the internet about it, as if it's not on the internet, it didn't happen, But this is something I've found. The last time I went to Puerto Rico 2 years ago, I got reports from right up until 2014 when I was there. None of these reports from 2012, 13 or 14 were shared with anybody else or were put on the internet. What it basically boils down to is that the ranchers were very reluctant to share these stories for fear that, they'd be ridiculed or whatever, so they kept the stories to themselves. But whenever I go to the island, and I know that there's, I've got sort of a researcher from a TV company or whatever, looking for witnesses, and when you speak to them and they realise that you are treating them seriously and you're not going to laugh at them and, you can show them respect, then they open up and tell you. So, in other words, it's not a case that we're not still getting reports, it's just that a lot of the people don't want to talk about what they've seen unless they feel sure and confident that they're going to be treated fairly. And so, I actually have found that I don't think the number of attacks has actually dropped to any great degree. It's just that most people, even in the paranormal field, aren't going to Puerto Rico anymore looking for the Chupacabra. The big difference is that I am, So I think that explains why there are so many Bigfoot reports, because there are a lot of Bigfoot researchers looking into these cases. Okay. The reason why there aren't many Chupacabra reports today is because there aren't many people like me still looking into it. So I think those are important issues to remember. But sightings are still going on. People are still reporting the large winged animals, and the farm animals killed like in very stealthy, silent fashions.
Right. So on your next research, as you continue the research into the Chupacabra, what areas would you like to focus on?
Well, I wouldn't at some point mind sort of getting more into the sort of Central America, Middle America, like, Mexico, Central America, South America, and digging into more of those kind of reports to see what, get out there and see how they parallel or differ, from the American reports and the Puerto Rican ones, and do some first-hand investigations there. And funnily enough, there actually are a lot of giant bat reports from South America. Ken Gerhard has uncovered a number of those type of cases, people seeing almost like man-sized bats hovering around and gliding through the skies. So, I think there's still a lot of surprises to be found.
Okay. I'm going to hand you over to Andy. He's got some other questions for you.
Yes. Hello, Nick.
Hey.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I got you.
Oh, good, excellent. Just a kind of related subject, really, of cattle and animal mutilation that seems to go on quite a bit in sort of your district of America, if you like. Have you perhaps got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, before I sort of get to my views on it, I actually often get asked, are the attacks undertaken by the Chupacabra, particularly in Puerto Rico, are they similar to the ones with the cattle mutilation? They're actually not, because with the Puerto Rican ones, it's just usually like a puncture wound to the neck. Occasionally, and also one to the stomach. But the American ones, we often find they really are drained of quite a lot of blood, and specific organs are taken, like the tongue, the sexual organs, and it looks like the bodies have been opened up, with some sort of technological, like a heat-type device, to cut through the skin, something like that. My personal view on the Texas on the United States cattle mutilations, I'm not personally convinced it's the work of extraterrestrials. I mean, there have been a lot of reports where people have seen unmarked helicopters in the area and things like this. And a researcher named Colm Kelleher wrote a very good book called Brain Trust, which looks at the cattle mutilation from a very disturbing phenomenon. I mean, all of us, on the show right now, although I live in the US, I grew up in the UK, we'll all remember the whole mad cow situation. When that broke out in cows, in cattle, and then it jumped, to CJD in people. You had it jumping from species to species, and that's when it caused a lot of fear in people. Well, one of the interesting things is that the symptoms of CJD actually are extremely similar to sort of the latter stages of Alzheimer's. Dementia kind of sets in. It's extremely similar. Now, Paul Kelleher's book talks about whether or not the massive rise in Alzheimer's in the US. If you look at the figures that in terms of Alzheimer's rising, not just in the US but in the UK, the figures are massive. I mean, almost incredibly massive in just the last 30 years, how they've just exploded. And he has wondered if, what we're actually dealing with is something similar to Alzheimer's, but which is now on the loose in the US food supply. And what's interesting is that Alzheimer's has significantly increased in the UK today as well. I know a lot about this because my mum died of Alzheimer's, and that's one of the interesting reasons why I followed this story. And what you find is that in a lot of the heavy beef-eating countries, they've had a significant rise in what is assumed to be Alzheimer's. But could it be some other form of dementia caused by some virus that's in the food supply? That's where Colm Kelleher thinks that what's going on is like a covert monitoring of the US cattle herd to see if some sort of, very disturbing virus is now spreading and is responsible for what is assumed to be an increase in Alzheimer's. I mean, to give you an example of, people will say, well, wouldn't we know if it was Alzheimer's? Well, with my mum, when she got it, she was diagnosed by being asked questions like, what year is it, and being shown pictures of famous actors, what's that person's name, and then being asked to repeat a sentence that the doctor said. That's how they diagnosed her dementia. It wasn't through a blood test or anything like that. And when she died, because she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, she wasn't autopsied. It was just death from the effects and the side effects of and complications from Alzheimer's. So, that often happens. It's like a memory type test is undertaken to determine if that's what it is. So, I don't think we can rule out the extraterrestrial angle, and I think it's not impossible that we could have actually several different things going on, like perhaps a monitoring of the cattle herd for emerging viruses, maybe things like cults, doing sacrificial rites, which is part and parcel of something that's gone on in Puerto Rico with the Chupacabra, and maybe even some genuine UFO-related ones. I think very often in ufology, there's this, not deliberate, but almost like an unconscious tendency to want to pigeonhole things in one category. That's UFOs are alien spacecraft, Bigfoot's an unknown ape, and not realizing that there could actually be several factors at work rather than just one answer to the mystery.
I certainly agree with what you were saying earlier, also along those lines of being from other places other than like nuts and bolts spacecraft, etc. There could be some dimensional stuff involved, which always
can sound more of an extreme idea, but I think it seems to tie in with so many things that we could, we can potentially put lots of things down to it being some kind of dimensional activity in itself. Speaking of that, I'm quite a regular watcher of Ancient Aliens and rather enjoy the series, and I know you've appeared on there several times. Are you, would you say you were a subscriber to the notion of Ancient Aliens visiting and perhaps altering our ancient ancestors?
Well, I've written a couple of books about, ancient alien-themed books over the years, and I am interested. If I wasn't, I wouldn't appear on Ancient Aliens. But I'm sort of very intrigued and fascinated by the theory, but, I try to, where possible, sort of go with the facts and rather than build up a belief system. So I'm always sort of careful to say that, I think, some of these stories like Ezekiel's Wheel, we can sort of interpret them today as, he had a close encounter with a UFO. You can make a good case for that. And, other people talk about like the Star of Bethlehem, being a UFO.
Yeah.
So I think in that sense, a case can be made, but I always try and sort of, demonstrate to people that it's a theory, and I don't like it when people say, I know for sure that, aliens, sort of visited the Earth 50,000 years ago and genetically altered this race of people. I think, if we present it as a theory and we offer data that is suggestive that in terms of actually supporting the theory, there's nothing wrong with that, providing we demonstrate to people that it is a theory and we're still trying to understand it, rather than write a book to say we know for sure that the Anunnaki visited the Earth in 30,000 BC or whatever. We don't know that for sure. What we have is intriguing information that suggests that could be the case.
Absolutely. I'm quite friendly with Andrew Collins, who I'm sure you've met before, and he's appeared in there quite a few times, and he would say he's not really a believer of ancient aliens, so it's interesting that sometimes people appear on the programme and they might be supporting a certain view that maybe they don't hold themselves. But,
well, I mean, whenever I've been on the show, they've always asked for me sort of my opinions, and if it's a question where I totally disagree with their view, I say, well, that's an interesting theory, but to me it doesn't hold water. Kind of if they ask me about the cattle mutilation angle, which they haven't, by the way, but if they did, I would give them the idea of some sort of covert monitoring of the food chain. Now, of course, it's like any show, to what extent your negative views appear on a show, you can never guarantee that because, it gets edited down. I've done some shows where I've presented my views on something, or they've asked me to talk about a particular... I'm not talking about Ancient Aliens now, but there have been other UFO shows where I was asked to speak about, for example, the moon landings. Now, I don't personally think the moon landings were hoax. I don't think we know the full story about what's gone on with the moon landings.
Yeah,
I don't think they were hoaxed. And so I was asked to explain, the general theory as to, the story of the moon landings being hoax. So I outlined that to them, and then I said, but here's my personal views as to why I don't think they were hoaxed. But they left all that out in the editing, so it actually looked like I was supporting the idea it was hoaxed. And that is one of the hazards of doing TV. So I'm always sort of very careful as to which shows I do and which ones I turn down,
Absolutely. Just a couple more questions really for me. I know obviously you've written extensively about a number of different topics, and UFOs, of course, has been sort of probably highest on that list of topics. If I were to say to you, give me one case, Nick, that you would say this is for me the strongest evidence of UFOs, as in aliens to other planets or other dimensions, but other things coming here. What would you say was for you personally, the strongest case that you found?
Well, I would say, I think it'd be difficult to pinpoint one, but I think one of the best would be the overflights of UFOs over Washington, D.C. in 1952. When there were multiple UFO reports across 2 weeks, picked up on radar, seen by military pilots, airline pilots. The pilots were seeing them at the same time that the radar was tracking them on the ground. And we know through the Freedom of Information Act that the Air Force, the FBI, the CIA, everybody was extremely concerned about this. We're not talking about sightings in the middle of the desert. We're talking about over Washington, D.C., so they clearly weren't, sort of tests of military aircraft. So there's that one. I would also say, the Rendlesham Forest case is an extremely strong one as well. I think there are certain things for me that kind of push that a little bit down, almost like a interdimensional kind of thing. The thing just kind of appeared, and you hear stories of these weird little creatures where some witnesses said they were sort of ghostly, like spectral almost. So I think Rendlesham's a good one. I think that the problem, as we go ahead in time, at least, there's a lot of classic ones from the 40s and 50s and 60s. I think the problem is the more we proceed into the 21st century and then into the 22nd, as our technology develops, it's going to become more and more difficult to, determine what's ours and what might be somebody else's. And I think what has happened over the years is that military agencies have probably realized that even though they don't know there's a UFO phenomenon, that they're probably not fully aware of what it is, but they realize that they can kind of exploit the real phenomenon as a cover for their tests of sort of prototype, weird, radical new aircraft, Then they can, if somebody sees one of these next generation stealth planes flying over and, it was seen by mistake by someone, all they have to do is spread a few local stories about little green men and things like that, and the truth gets buried under the alien angle. But that's not to take away the fact that there clearly is a real phenomenon, but I think it's one that, as I said, has been used over the years to cover other things up as well.
I absolutely agree with that line. Certainly that the CIA undoubtedly made use of the UFO phenomenon to cover up activities of their own and military testing of experimental craft. I think definitely is the case that they use the UFO phenomenon as a way of hiding that. But like you, I agree there's also more to it than that some of this stuff
no doubt about that.
Genuine. And Rendlesham Forest is one that I've personally been quite fascinated by for years. I mean, you may know we've had Larry Warren on here before talking about it a couple of times. But there's a story that was related to me a few years ago by someone I knew quite well at the time, who was from the immediate area of Rendlesham, that a farmer nearby the forest actually, in the 1930s, I think it was, apparently dug up a human skull that was strangely elongated. He reported it to the authorities, it was taken away, and that was the last he's ever heard of it. But it was actually, he dug it up in a field near Rendlesham Forest. And he swears blind it's absolutely true story.
It's interesting you mention that, because I got a lot of other weird stories from Rendlesham. I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Wild Man, which is all about a very controversial story of Bigfoot in Britain. Now, there's clearly not a physical, colony of giant apes roaming the UK. That'd be ridiculous. But people do see things like that. But there's not a single case on record that I have that doesn't have sort of paranormal overtones to them. But for years, for centuries actually, there's been reports of a creature from what is today Rendlesham Forest, known as the shug monkey, S-H-U-G, which is actually like a derivation of an old English word meaning demon, so like demon monkey, from Rendlesham. There have also been a number of sort of, these large black cats roaming around Rendlesham Forest, kind of like the more famous Beast of Exmoor and the Beast of Bodmin and the Beast of everywhere else,
Yes.
But there's a lot of reports of those from Rendlesham Forest, and also a few classic phantom black dogs type stories, the kind that inspired Conan Doyle to write The Hound of the Baskervilles, and a few of those stories. So, in other words, Rendlesham Forest is very much like Point Pleasant in West Virginia, where John Keel investigated Mothman, but, then he had run-ins with the Men in Black and UFOs and other weird creatures. So, kind of like you have certain hotspots around the planet. And that's why I wonder if the interdimensional one is probably the correct one. We could be looking at sort of maybe almost like static doorways in different places across the planet that allow all these things through. But we don't understand how to do it, for the most part at least. Whether somebody behind the scenes does is, different. But I do kind of wonder if the Earth is almost like the equivalent of like the London Underground. You've got all these different get-on and get-off points if you know how to access it. And I do sometimes wonder if, when you get places like Rendlesham, Point Pleasant, numerous other places around the planet, like the Cannock Chase near where I grew up, that's sort of another hotspot. I do sometimes wonder if there could be portals from other areas realms.
That's exactly what we were saying last week. Funny enough, we had a chap from Warminster talking about the UFOs over Warminster, and I've held that view for a long time. There are undoubtedly spots and places on the Earth which seem to be magnets for these strange events, or portals or doorways. And your idea of the underground with the stations, actually, that's a good one. That is a good way of putting it. The other thing I want to just very quickly mention, which you might find interesting as well, Nick, talking about Rendlesham, is I was at a book launch yesterday, which looks into folklore and magic of East Anglia, and discovered that, I don't know exactly who was involved, but there was certainly a very strong witchcraft-based group working in the 1980s who used Rendlesham Forest as one of their locations. Now, that made me think, I wonder if it's... I'm not saying that what they encountered was the witchcraft group, but I wonder if their activities perhaps stirred up the atmosphere or energies of the area, if you like, that they may well have affected the area. The guy actually joked that we were active at the time when the Rendlesham Forest UFO incident took place, and he says we weren't there around Christmas at all, so we wouldn't have been us they saw, but the idea that maybe something they were doing has caused an effect. I thought that was absolutely fascinating.
Well, actually, it's interesting you bring that up, because that reminded me of something I didn't mention. Probably about 18 or 19 years ago now, I actually heard a story of witchcraft from Rendlesham, and it revolved around some group, allegedly at least, I mean, bear that in mind. They supposedly conjured up what looked like a shadowy vision of a giant spider. And it was sort of like, ridiculously big. We're talking about sort of 5 feet across, but it obviously wasn't a real spider, but it was like a shadowy, like I said, an apparition of a spider briefly sort of manifested in the woods. So, that was an odd one.
You remember where you got that from? Because that's just rung a vague bell from something I might have read years ago. Do you remember where you heard that? Because that's ringing a kind of vague bell about a giant spider formation.
Oh, well, I can tell you when I heard it, it would have been... Probably it would have been sometime between 97 and 99, because I actually did a lot of lectures out in Suffolk and Norfolk and some of the little towns around there periodically through that period. I probably did 7 or 8 over the course of the 2 years, so, sort of about 4 or 5 a year or whatever. Okay. But I couldn't pin it down any more than that, but I can tell you that it came from people who... The people I got it from were not anybody connected to the group. They were like us, they were researchers and they'd heard the story. Right. But it was like, something that was, as I said, briefly manifested and then was gone again. So.
Well, certainly from what was being talked about yesterday, there is definitely a strong connection to East Anglia and folklore and magic, which, that can perhaps tie into Rendlesham as being almost like a modern manifestation of something that was much older that's occurred many times before. But that's absolutely fascinating. I'm going to hand back to Sue now. That was really my sort of little collection of questions. So, Sue, back to you.
All right, cheers, mate.
Cheers. We've got Tom Martin's asked a couple of questions. We've got just a couple more to give to you, if that's all right. I hope you're okay for time. Right, Tony Martin's asked 2 questions. First of all, can you update him with the APEN group, APEN, and its background, please? That's his first question.
Okay. APEN, for those who may not know, the Aerial Phenomena Inquiry Network was this sort of mysterious group that surfaced in the mid-70s in the UK. And sent these weird, bizarre, anonymous letters to various researchers at the time, like, for example, Jenny Randall's, and these strange recordings claiming that there was this sort of network of people. They kind of alluded, or at least it appeared as if they might have had some sort of official connections, but they were also tied to like a lot of ultra-right-wing groups as well in politics. And I wrote about this story in a 2006 book I wrote called On the Trail of the Saucer Spies. And funnily enough, I've been thinking about doing a book on APEN because I've got a lot more material since. And there's some indications that they were actually, could have been almost like a government-sponsored agency to try and infiltrate ufology, or almost like a shadowy group within government that actually wasn't an official part of the government, almost like a black ops type group that had its own agenda, but it was still made up of these sort of ultra-right wingers. So hopefully at some point in the future, I may be able to do something with this, because I have actually over the last couple of years have followed up on a number of leads. The only problem is some of them are sort of fragments of stories that need sort of deeper investigations. But to sort of, condense it was a very odd story of this particular group that seemed to know a hell of a lot about the private lives of certain people in ufology and what they were doing and who they were speaking to and sharing information, but at the same time it was as if they deliberately wanted to kind of unsettle the people as well. So there's more of an agenda at work, and one theory is that there could have been a couple of different APANs where different people kind of adopted the term for their own agendas, which makes it even more complicated, if you like.
Right, okay. The other question he's asking is, does Nick expect any new revelations from the potentially new MOD UFO files and his thoughts on the documents that were destroyed by asbestos?
Well, yeah, I mean, the asbestos destruction is interesting because it ties in with some of the stories from over here. Like, for example, a lot of the original files from the old Roswell Army Air Force Base from 1940, from 46 to 50. Pretty much all of the outgoing messages from the base are gone. They cannot be found anywhere. And, it's not like the government's saying we won't release them. Archivists have gone looking, and it's almost as if somebody went in years ago and just grabbed them all, and no one can find them. And you hear this on a number of occasions. For example, the asbestos issue at the National Archives, if people aren't aware, that they destroyed a whole swathe of official files because they'd been affected by asbestos, and because asbestos, can be lethal to people. We never had access to them. The guys had to go in like hazmat suits into that particular area of the vaults and, have them destroyed. But there are other cases from the UK which are, extremely similar to that. In the 1950s, we know that thanks to Ralph Noyes, who used to work for the MOD in one of their UFO offices, that the MOD at the time had, or the old Air Ministry at the time, had gun camera footage of UFOs taken by pilots. Nick Pope in the 1990s went looking for that and couldn't find it anywhere. And yet, we got some of the most innocuous lights in the sky type reports of being declassified. And yet we're told that, the gun camera footage was destroyed. It should be the other way round. And as far as the other part of the question is concerned, certainly there's been some interesting material released through the Freedom of Information Act and the old 30-year ruling that the government used to use. Like pilot sightings and some radar reports. I mean, some of the 50s ones are really good. A lot of interesting ones from the 60s, and then you had that Condign report. The issue I have with what's surfaced so far is, although there is a lot of interesting material, and I'm sure we'll still get some interesting reports in the new cases, I think it's kind of like over here, in the same way that Project Blue Book was the US Air Force's primary UFO program, and before that there's Project Grudge and Project Sign, and the CIA had the Robertson panel and things like this. I still believe that somewhere in the US there's like a far more deeply buried covert group that is sitting on the really sensational material, which could include like craft and bodies and that kind of thing. And whereas, with Nick Pope, I don't think Nick, has lied about what he saw and did when he was in the Ministry of Defence. When he said, I never found anything about crashed UFOs or dead aliens, it was just reports coming in primarily from the public. I believe Nick's telling the truth when he says that. But where I differ with Nick is that I don't think he was the only group investigating this.
No.
We know, for example, that the intelligence divisions of the Ministry of Defence were doing work that was independent of some of the work that the office in which Nick Pope worked for several years was involved in. It's kind of like the need-to-know concept. A few years ago, well, actually more than a few years ago now, Robin Cole wrote an excellent report on UFO sightings and cases and people in the field investigated by GCHQ, which for American listeners is the British equivalent of the NSA. And as a result of this, Robin found himself on the receiving end of a visit from Special Branch, which I actually wrote about the visit from Special Branch that he got in my On the Trail of the Source of Spies book. So we know Special Branch have been involved, as well as the Ministry of Defence. The Provost and Security Services, which is like the James Bonds of the Air Force, they've long been rumoured to be at the forefront of UFO investigations, independent of the MOD. And several of those reports have now surfaced at the Public Record Office, as it used to be called, today the National Archives. And I actually think those may have sort of been declassified by mistake, because one of the files actually went missing under very odd circumstances for several months until a member of Parliament looked into this to try and figure out where the file had vanished to, and then lo and behold, it suddenly turned up again. So, there's clear evidence that there's more going on than is just reflected in the files that we're getting to see.
Right, okay. So we've enjoyed your conversation about the Chupacabra. We've been dying to talk about that for ages, actually, or I have anyway, because it's so fascinating. Are there any other pending projects to, pardon the pun, get your teeth into?
That's a good one. Well, there's actually several. I mean, I mentioned the whole ancient astronauts thing. I've actually got a book coming out next month. It's called Weapons of the Gods.
Right.
And it deals with a lot of these stories you may have heard of about alleged ancient nuclear war in the distant past.
Yeah.
That people may have existed before us and, went the way that we might go one day, and then, civilization starts over in cycles. That book, Weapons of the Gods, comes out at the end of April. Then I've got one out in September called Nessie. It's all about the Loch Ness Monster, but it deals with what I sort of alluded to earlier, with all the weird stuff surrounding Loch Ness.
Yeah.
For example, people think of Loch Ness and the Loch Ness Monster, they think, well, is it a plesiosaur, is it this, is it that? A lot of people don't realise all the weird stuff that goes on at Loch Ness and has done. I talk about all of this in the book. For example, like Aleister Crowley, one of the world's most famous or infamous occultists, had a house on the shores of Loch Ness, Boleskine House, and tried to summon up, he performed all sorts of rituals to try and summon up paranormal entities from Loch Ness. On top of that, 2 owners of Loch Ness committed suicide. Prior to that, you had reports centuries before the Loch Ness Monster, or the term Loch Ness Monster, or the term Nessie was in use, centuries ago, there were reports of what were known as kelpies in many Scottish lochs, but most of them came from Loch Ness. They were described as like shape-shifting creatures that could take on different forms. There have been multiple UFO sightings, as I said earlier, over Loch Ness, Men in Black reports. A lot of people don't know that there's actually under Loch Ness like an ancient equivalent of Stonehenge. No one knows who built it, but it was obviously built when the water levels were different, and it's called Kleinhenge. If you Google that, it's Klein, Kleinhenge, you'll find the story, and it goes back to the 70s when this sort of stone formation was found under Loch Ness. So, and there are also large black cat sightings around Loch Ness. So you don't just have one mystery animal, you have at least 2. So the book is, it's one of these that's like a study of the paranormal theory for the Loch Ness Monster and everything else that goes on there.
Right, okay. Sounds very interesting. You'll have to send me a copy of that.
Oh yeah, well, I'll tell you what, if you send me your mailing address, I can get. It doesn't matter that you're in the UK and most of the books are published in the US. They'll be happy to mail you review copies of all the new books.
That'd be great.
No problem at all.
What is your advice to anyone who would like to research further these subjects and maybe join in expeditions?
Well, if it's what you want to do it. I mean, that's what I always say to people. We got one life. You might as well enjoy it while you got it.
Yeah.
And live it to its fullest. That's why I do what I do. As long as I enjoy doing it and I can bring something new to the table, hopefully with each book, I'll keep on doing it. And I would say to people, if you've got an interest in these phenomena, most places, have a local group, paranormal group or UFO group or whatever. You can find them all over the place, and most of them have sort of monthly meetings, that kind of thing. And, you get to know people who are into the same things as you. That you can share information. There's no stigmas or anything like that. And also, writing, if somebody wants to get into the field of paranormal writing, to blow some bubbles that sort of people, destroy the myths that some people believe. No one's going to become a millionaire, right? In UFO books or Bigfoot books, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But for me, I'm never going to be driving a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, but I get a great deal of sort of satisfaction out of what I do.
What you do, yeah.
And I would rather do a job that pays an average income that I enjoy than being a bored millionaire. You know what I mean?
This is it.
So freelance writing is a notoriously difficult job. Many people who do it can't make a full-time living from it. I can, because I also do like a lot of ghost writing and freelance writing, proofreading and editing work for other authors. But I mean, I'll be quite perfectly frank with you, I could not earn a living from writing books alone, my books, but I can earn a living from all the other spin-off stuff like lectures. And as I said, proofreading and editing for other authors. The only this isn't a downside or a way to detract people from entering the field, but what I would say, what I've found personally, and I know a lot of other people have found, is that when you kind of dig into a lot of these weird phenomena, it's almost like the weird phenomena realizes that you've noticed it and that you're looking for it. And a lot of people are reporting what's become known as like psychic backlash, the idea that you start looking for these things and they know it, and then they start targeting you, and people begin to have like weird synchronicities or strange things go on in their lives. And some people, for me, it kind of pushes me on and energizes me. But I do know some people who become very frightened and paranoid by the fact that it appears like the phenomena they're looking into has then started targeting them. So I always tell people, be aware that there are some hazards, but, if you're interested in these things, well, do whatever you want to do to find the truth for yourself. I think that's what we're all striving to do.
Okay. Andy, you said you've got a point?
Yeah, just a quick one. I don't know if Nick knows that Bolskin, Crowley's house that he owned for a while, that's burnt down recently.
Yeah, that in itself is kind of strange. But I'll actually be back in. Just one thing I forgot to mention. I'll be back in the UK in September. I'll be speaking, excuse me, at Gary Heseltine's UFO Truth Conference in Holmfirth in Yorkshire.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
How long are you coming over for?
I'm probably going to come for about 2 weeks, because what I'm going to do, the conference itself will be at the end of the last 2 weeks, and I'm just going to go down and spend about 10 days with my dad and hang out with him and hang out with a bunch of old school friends and drink some strong beer and get some fish and chips down me.
Well, we're only in Manchester, so if you fancy a coffee while you're up here.
Oh, that'll be perfect. I'm actually flying into Manchester and out of Manchester.
Cool. So if you want to pop in for a coffee, just let us know.
Oh, well, definitely do that. Yeah, what I'll do, closer to the date, I'll catch up with you and we can figure a time and a place and whatever.
Okay. Well, just to finish off then, Nick, where can people get your book? Where can they find out more about you, your website, etc.?
Okay, yeah, sure. Well, all my books are available on Amazon, whether Amazon.com or in the UK on Amazon.co.uk.
Yeah.
People can reach me. I've got a blog which is titled World of Whatever, and if you just type in Nick Redfern World of Whatever, you'll see the blog, and it has a contact section which takes people to my Facebook page. Or if you just want to go to Facebook, you can just type in Nick Redfern. There's 7 or 8 Nick Redferns, I think, but you'll scroll down and you'll see me somewhere. But I try and update the blog most days with articles I've written or cases that I'm investigating, that kind of thing. And, always happy to chat with people. And the way I kind of look at it, we're all in it together, sharing information and trying to figure out what's going on. I don't have much time for all the egos in the subject, and so if people want to contact me, I'm always happy to share information, answer questions, or, all the good stuff.
Right, Andy, I'm sorry, I cut you off. I didn't know you had 2 points.
Yes, good one. I just wanted to mention Nick. I don't know if he's mentioned this in his book. If you're actually covering that stuff about Crowley's life, beside not necessarily when he was doing his sort of magical work there. He was attempting the.
What I did. Go on.
Yeah. I just want to say to those listening as well that the ritual he was working on was called the Abramelin, which is probably one of the most complicated, detailed occult rituals you can possibly get involved in, and it's very delicate. It has to be done over a long period of time, and typical Crowley didn't finish it. So it's often been suggested that some of the strange activity around the area could be as a result of him not completing one of the most powerful, potentially dangerous magic rituals you can carry out. And you say he didn't finish it, so I don't know if you know about that.
That's actually a good point. That is a good point, because, you look at a lot of people, sort of look at this angle of sort of residual energy, whether positive or negative. I mean, people often say, in paranormal investigations, they just get a weird vibe from a certain place, as if, it's like bad energy, but nobody can really figure out what bad energy is, but you get this sort of weird vibe from it. But yeah, I talk about, obviously, background on Crowley. I didn't want to just sort of plunge into the story of Loch Ness, but provide the reader with background on this. But there's no doubt in my mind that, there is sort of like a residual weird vibe at Loch Ness. A lot of the researchers who went to Loch Ness, expecting just to be investigating reports of like surviving plesiosaurs or giant eels or whatever, came away unsettled by a very, sort of malignant atmosphere, if you like. And then they started to find themselves, like I mentioned earlier, getting weird synchronicities. Other researchers, like Ted Holliday, who wrote a book called The Dragon and the Disc and the Goblin Universe, he talked about how he'd have camera problems, trying to photograph the loch, and where he thought he might have seen something strange. The pictures didn't come out, or they were fogged, and he felt that he was almost in like some sort of Matrix world, where reality wasn't as it seemed to be. A lot of people get that when they sort of dig themselves further and further into a lot of these mysteries. Like I said, it's as if you're living in a strange, very, very strange world. I've had some really weird stuff like that go on. It didn't push me away from the subject. It pushes me. You wanted to find out why it's going on, but I could talk all day about some really strange stuff that sort of happens.
All right, yeah. It's absolutely fascinating stuff. Anyway, back to you, Caesar.
Okay. Thanks very much anyway, Nick. I'm sorry if we've taken up too much of your time.
Oh, no, I'm crashed out on the couch, so I'm fine.
That's the way to do it, isn't it?
So it's a Sunday afternoon, Sunday afternoons are the same everywhere, you have your dinner and then you crash out. So.
Okay, my love. Well, thank you very much for taking time to talk to us today. And I wish you all the best of luck with whatever you're doing.
All right, thanks, guys. Thank you.
Okay, and remember, don't be a stranger.
I won't. No, I'll stay in touch and send me your address so I can send the review, or have the publisher send the review books. And
all right, my darling.
And then, like I said, closer to the date, I'll let you know when I'm over for the Manchester conference.
Okay, babe. No problem. Take care.
You too, guys. See you later.
Bye.
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 It's good night from me.
And it's good night from her.
And it's good night from me.
Okay. So, good night. Don't forget to keep the paranormal friendly. Good night and God bless.
This is where it's at.
You're listening to Parasearch UK Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.